Thank you for having me tonight. I've been a guest speaker of the Norfolk Historical Society before, but it's been a number of years, so it's good to be back here at the MacArthur Memorial and to see actually a number of familiar faces. Some of you look familiar. You come to these all the time, I'm sure. All right, Craney Island. On June 22nd, 1813, a British landing force of approximately 1,500 soldiers, Marines, and sailors attempted to reduce the American defenses on Craney Island in order to attack Norfolk and Portsmouth, Virginia, and destroy the Gosport Navy Yard and capture the frigate Constellation. The British were repulsed by less than 800 personnel from the American Army, Navy, Marine Corps, and Virginia militia. The city's ship and shipyard were saved without the loss of an American life. End of story. That concludes my presentation. Are there any questions? All right, if only it were that simple. The Battle of Craney Island has an identity crisis. Part of that lies with the physical attributes of the island today resembling nothing of its original shape some 200 years ago. The other part is due to timing. Good news of the victory would normally be welcomed by the American public, but it was quickly overshadowed by two other military disasters on the heels of the battle that diminished its significance. One was the British occupation of Hampton, Virginia, and the atrocities committed against its citizens. The other was the emerging news of the defeat of the frigate Chesapeake and the loss of its captain, James Lawrence. Add to this the delay in submitting the much-sought details of the battle in the report of the island's commander, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Beatty, and you quickly have old news. As such, the battle is all but footnote material in those works that acknowledge the battle at all. Fortunately, a number of recollections of the battle from participants on both sides emerged in the mid-1800s that kept the spirit and memory of the battle alive. These accounts, however, appeared to be extremely biased towards the group affiliated with the writer, be it militia or Navy or Royal Marine, and simple details were often in great conflict from account to account. One of the most minutely detailed and vivid accounts of this, often cited by historians and history writers, came from a private in the Virginia militia who was not even on the island at the time of the battle. Careful reconstruction of the battle does not change its outcome, but it does shed light on a number of aspects of the battle and its strategic aftermath that make it truly unique. Our story actually begins exactly 6 years earlier as the frigate Chesapeake was sailing for a Mediterranean voyage. As it passed the anchorages at Lynnhaven Bay, it may have noticed the British warship HMS Leopard weigh anchor and follow the Chesapeake out of the bay. After attempts to hail the Chesapeake, the Leopard opened fire. The broadsides killed 3 and wounded 18. Refusing to accept the surrender of the ship by Commodore James Barron, the British removed 5 sailors that supposedly deserted from British ships. The incident brought the United States and Great Britain to the brink of war. Along the shores of the Chesapeake Bay at the time was an engineer named William Tatham, who was conducting a coastal survey for the government. Tatham took it upon himself to be the eyes and ears on the scene for President Thomas Jefferson, detailing British presence and movement and even plying his letters with fantastic stories of narrowly avoiding capture and being target of British spies. The British, in all likelihood, did not even know he was there. Tatham, however, did provide Jefferson with a series of improvements to defenses to the area. These included a series of telegraph stations, sending visual signals and coded numbers extending from Cape Henry all the way to Washington. And that is a drawing, hard to see, of his signal station, and there are a series of numbers on there. They would be coded. Each number or series of numbers would equal a different word or signal or message. One station saw it, passes on to the next one, passes on to the next one, and so on. Batteries to protect the inlets at Lynnhaven and Crump's Hill to stop landing parties. Floating batteries and fire rafts stationed in Lynnhaven Inlet to attack British ships at anchor, even though at this time fire rafts were kind of going out of style in naval warfare. and a military canal connecting the eastern branch of the Elizabeth River at Kempsville with the Lynnhaven River to allow rapid response from gunboats to threats at the bay entrance. None of these proposals were considered by Jefferson, perhaps because Jefferson did not like being shown the flaws of his current defense program. Jefferson's concept focused on using gunboats to defend coastal areas and major cities. His gunboat program, much derided, was in full swing when gunboats replaced ocean-going warships. Over 250 gunboats were built for coastal and port defense, with over 20 of them in the Hampton Roads area. The gunboats were designed to operate in concert with coastal defense fortifications. Norfolk had two forts. Fort Norfolk mounted 25 24-pound cannons, but routinely had an insufficient number of troops assigned to man all the guns. The same was true with Fort Nelson across the Elizabeth River. The crossfire from cannon was designed to prevent warships and armed vessels from proceeding up the Elizabeth River toward Norfolk and Portsmouth. The defense scheme relied largely on local militia for support during emergencies, and the availability of training and qualified personnel was the biggest flaw in Jefferson's plan. In charge of all the British naval forces in North America was the Right Honorable Sir John Borlase Warren, Baronet, Knight of the Bath, Admiral of the Blue, and Commander-in-Chief of His Majesty's ships and warships employed and to be employed on the American and West Indies Squadron, etc., etc. I don't think the local print shop liked making his business cards. Warren was directed to blockade the Chesapeake Bay and use the naval forces to conduct raids on military posts and stores in the region. This was designed as a diversion with the idea to create an imminent threat in the coastal areas to prevent these states from reinforcing American forces operating along the Canadian border. At the time, the Americans were winning along the Canadian border. The British needed some relief, create a diversion elsewhere, create a threat somewhere. What better place than the Chesapeake Bay? In January and February of 1813, British ships began arriving to blockade the entrance of the Chesapeake Bay, led by the HMS Maidstone. Captures of American vessels began immediately. Governor James Barber pleaded for federal troops to protect the area from British forces, but was told to rely on their internal resources for defense, meaning, hey, militia, you got this one. On February 4, 1813, while sailing from Washington down the Chesapeake Bay on a war patrol, the frigate Constellation spotted the British squadron at Lynnhaven. Captain Charles Stewart wisely fled for safety of the Elizabeth River and its defenses. On the coast, one of the first raids in Virginia was on the Cape Henry Lighthouse. The raid, witnessed by the lighthouse keeper Travie Burrows, was detailed in the local newspapers as, quote, a band of veterans from Admiral Warren's squadron landed at the lighthouse on Cape Henry and with the most undaunted heroism attacked the pantry and smokehouse of the keeper, captured his hams, mince pies, and sausages, leaving not a link behind. The raid on the lighthouse for food shows the challenges the British faced in maintaining the blockade. The nearest bases of supply were either Halifax or Bermuda, forcing many ships to raid for forage. Indeed, many of the raids along the Chesapeake Bay sought the acquisition of needed supplies more than the destruction of military stores. Leading the raids and blockade operations were Admiral Sir George Cockburn. Cockburn had his eye on capturing and destroying the Constellation as a worthy target. By raiding areas with little defenses and coupled with the tepid response by local militiamen, who generally fled when fired upon, Cockburn was convinced that attack in Norfolk with the goal of destroying the Constellation would be easy. Cockburn was undeniably the expert on raiding and amphibious operations in North America. His past experience in this method of warfare enabled him to develop a certain assault methodology that was uniquely his. His raids around the Chesapeake Bay were characterized by overwhelming force, early morning or first light landings for the element of surprise, armed boats for fire support against artillery or coast defenses ashore during the assault, and the integration of Congreve rocket boats leading the assault waves to strike terror into both defender and citizen alike. Captain Frederick Hickey of the sloop of war Atalante, well-trained in Coburn tactics, was scouting the Atlantic coast side of Princess Anne County. Spotting livestock grazing near two windmills in an area called Dam Neck, he landed a party that handed the proprietor a note requesting the livestock. This was just another indicator of the ongoing British supply challenges. Not realizing, however, that the proprietor could not read, and believing a snub had occurred, the livestock were seized and the mills set ablaze. A skirmish with local militia ensued, giving rise to local lore and the sea attack. Hickey would later wreck the Atalante while heading to Halifax. Included in 133 people rescued from the wreck were 20 former slaves from Hickey's earlier raids along the James River in Princess Anne County. So not only were they raiding for food, they were raiding to disrupt the economy via the slave labor of the local areas. Word of the British raid, captures, and forced movements arrived at the Fort Norfolk headquarters of Brigadier General Robert Taylor of the Virginia Militia, commander of all ground forces in the Hampton Roads area. It appeared that the British were about to attack Norfolk. The arrival in Lynnhaven Bay on June 18, 1813, of a force of 13 British ships carrying about 2,400 soldiers, Marines, and 2 companies of independent foreigners reinforced that belief. Here is where Craney Island played a critical role. The importance of Craney Island was recognized as early as the Revolutionary War. It was believed back then that had a battery been erected on the island, it would have been sufficient to stop Lord Dunmore's ships from bombarding Norfolk from the Elizabeth River. Taylor and Captain Charles Stewart, who ran the Constellation into safety of Norfolk on February 4th, recognized it as well and sought the approval from their respective chains of command to fortify Craney. Colonel Walker K. Armistead, an Army engineer and 3rd graduate of West Point, was the architect and builder of the defenses on Craney Island. Armistead had developed plans for fortifying Craney Island as early as 1809 and was the undeniable expert on the island's defensibility. Coburn recognized Craney Island as the critical terrain in the Norfolk area defenses. He conducted extensive reconnaissance of the defenses, sounding water routes and prospective landing areas, collecting intelligence on the strengths and design of the defenses, and determining the number and the readiness of the defenders. This map was reportedly drawn by Coburn based on his assessment of the area. Coburn's plan for attacking Norfolk was comprehensive and based on his months of preparation and probing of the area. Using overwhelming force, he would reduce the defenses on Craney Island, land forces on the east and west banks of the Elizabeth River, and proceed on land to attack Forts Norfolk and Nelson from their undefended rears, and by sea up the river to attack the Constellation. Using the well-trained forces on the ships under his command, combined with the troops under Brigadier General Sir Sidney Beckwith aboard Warren ships, the destruction of the area was all but assured. With the growing number of British forces massing in the area, Taylor convened a war council of his top commanders on June 19th and posed one simple question. Under present circumstances, is it proper to evacuate the post to Craney Island if the disposition of the enemy should indicate an attack on the island or on the forts on the harbor of Norfolk? Unanimously, all 13 commanders present at the War Council voted to abandon the island. This action alone would have left the entrance of the Elizabeth River unguarded and open for attack by the British. Taylor supported the vote on abandonment, citing his adversity to hazarding the forces there on the island, primarily minimally trained and largely untested militia, particularly in the face of an overwhelming threat. One officer, however, not present at the War Council, Colonel Walker K. Armistead, had a difference of opinion with Taylor's order to abandon the island. Presumably on Craney Island, overseeing construction of the defenses during the First War Council, Armistead convinced Taylor that the island could be held with as few as 300 men, utilizing the defenses already in place. Taylor convened another war council on June 20th, allowing Armistead to plead his case on the strength of the defenses on Craney Island. The Second War Council included 2 additional officers invited by Taylor: Commodore John Casson, commander of the Gosport Navy Yard and the senior Navy officer in the region, and Captain Joseph Tarbell, current commanding officer of the frigate Constellation. The Navy had just returned from a successful gunboat attack on the HMS Junin in Hampton Roads, and coupled with Armistead's testimony on the defenses, the War Council took on a very different tone. The question now put to vote asked whether under present circumstances it be advisable to withdraw the forces from Craney Island. The results this time were 12 in favor of maintaining the defenses, 2 in favor of abandoning the island, and 1 on maintaining them, but only if they were reinforced. Casson promised gunboat support in the waters surrounding the island, and Tarbell sent 100 sailors and 50 Marines from the Constellation to assist in manning the island's defenses. The sailors were all gunners from the Constellation. They were trained and knew how to handle the 18 and 24-pound cannon on the island. The result was a reversal of the original decision, made perhaps without the full awareness or understanding of the defenses, but one that could have easily spelled doom for the cities of Norfolk, Portsmouth, the frigate Constellation, and the Gosport Navy Yard. Maintaining the island's defenses, reinforcing it, and adding the Navy support was enough to counter the lackluster British performance in their attack on Craney Island. The performance failure was not due to Coburn. Coburn would not have the opportunity to lead this operation following his months of planning. Warren was censured by the Admiralty for allowing his commanders, like Coburn and Hickey, to focus more on raiding insignificant coastal towns than on maintaining the blockade. Coburn was placed on the frigate Barossa to provide general support from the frigates for the landing. He was put in timeout. The attack on Craney Island began with a diversionary landing in the vicinity of the Pleasure House on Chesapeake Bay. With direct road communication to Norfolk, the British wanted to create the impression that this was the main axis of attack, drawing off troops from the Elizabeth River defenses. The Pleasure House was used during the war as a militia lookout post to report British movement on the bay and was later burned by the British. Back in Hampton Roads, Beckwith landed with 800 troops to the west of Craney Island at Hoffler Creek. Intolerable confusion, as one of his Marines puts it. The amphibious assault on the island was left to Captain Samuel Pachol of the San Domingo. Even Warren's barge, nicknamed the Centipede, and commanded by Captain John Hanchett, that didn't happen during the battle, but that's it. Captain John Hanchett of the HMS Diadem, and equipped with a brass 3-pound cannon, parasol, and pet dog, they didn't take this seriously, was used to lead the boats containing about 700 men to shore. The result of the attacks on both land and sea were a series of missteps that combined resulted in an abysmal failure. Beckwith's attack from landward side was stifled by high tide, preventing the crossing of the thoroughfare between the island and the mainland. Sustained artillery fire from the Americans inflicted heavy casualties, and most of the British Congreve rockets fired from this position landed harmlessly in the water. Without any artillery, the British were unable to counter the American artillery barrage. Chaos, insubordination, and desertions from the independent companies led to a hasty retreat back to the boats. Out on Hampton Roads, several hours later, the boats began their approach as the tide was ebbing and grounded well offshore, but well within range of the American cannon. Several boats were destroyed since the troops did not know that wading the final distance ashore was required. Even if they knew to disembark upon grounding, the new troops did not even rehearse loading and unloading boats. No one appeared to be in charge. The boats mounted with cannon and Congreve rockets were in the rear, and the weapons could not be brought to bear. Eventually, the boats turned and retreated back to the vessels. The difficulty in understanding these factors and implementing a plan to mitigate them was known, but apparently only to Cockburn. Whether Cockburn tried to communicate with and was marginalized by Warren on these factors, or willingly decided to withhold them upon being removed from leading the operation, is a matter of speculation. The operation, however, was very atypical of any operation that Cockburn led to success before or after Craney Island. 3 days later at Hampton, this time led by Cockburn, the operation, a simultaneous assault with overwhelming firepower, reducing the primary defenses, and the quick capture of the town, was a complete success. It was the behavior of the independent companies after capturing the town, however, that marred the victory for the British. One might speculate that the only reason for capturing Hampton was to have a victory to make up for the loss of Craney Island. That might be the case since Hampton had minimal value as a military target. Following Hampton, Cockburn did make an attack on Ocracoke and Portsmouth on the Outer Banks with the possible intention of attacking Norfolk via North Carolina through the Great Bridge. No further action against Norfolk materialized following these attacks. The loss of Craney Island began a shift in the overall British strategy along the coast. The day after the battle, Warren, in a letter to John Croker, Secretary of the Admiralty, stated that capturing Norfolk area objectives cannot now be effected with less than 5,000 or 6,000 men. By August, raids on towns and military objects greatly diminished and all but ceased for the rest of 1813 and the first half of 1814. Greater enforcement of the blockade and landing only to water or forage appeared to be the primary operations during this time. One reason for this was the loss of the force designed to conduct these raids, namely the Independent Company of Foreigners. With British forces fighting Napoleon in Europe, it made sense to try a bold experiment and utilize French prisoners to fight in the Americas. Less than 2 weeks after Craney, Warren indicated that the state of the foreign company is such as to render their longer continuance with the troops here impossible. The small number of regular British forces indicated they were apprehensive that if they landed, the men would seize them and deliver them to the enemy. Beckwith had expressed such apprehension even before the forces arrived in Bermuda in May. The loss of a significant portion of their landing force was certainly an impact on continued operations in the coastal areas. Cockburn, through his meticulous planning, had designs on Annapolis, Baltimore, and even Washington, D.C. in 1813. He recognized the small number of Marines, artillery companies, and trained sailors he had on board his ships were not enough to take such large cities. He would have to wait until the situation changed in Europe or when more reliable forces were dedicated to the American theater. He continued to have his sights on the Constellation, however, reportedly boarding the vessel in 1814 disguised as a fisherman. While Craney Island may not have eliminated the threat of further British attacks along the coastal areas of the United States, it did significantly stifle the British momentum and initiative in the region and create certain trepidation of the British forces when they did actually land. Meanwhile, it gave the Americans time to increase and strengthen their defenses in many areas. 15 months after the Battle of Craney Island, British forces marched on and burned parts of Washington, where militia forces defending the route into the city behaved as Cockburn hoped and fled. The British did not remain in the city very long, fearing a counterattack. Later, they tried to take Baltimore, but were unable to penetrate the defenses protecting the city and water approaches, and just simply gave up. It is possible, perhaps before the attack on Baltimore, that Walker K. Armistead, designer of the defenses of Craney Island, compared notes with his brother, George Armistead, designer of the defenses at Baltimore. It would make for an interesting conversation. I'll let you decide on this aspect of the legacy of Craney Island.